In 1944, the government started drafting incarcerated Japanese American citizens from concentration camps. Similarities are apparent between European, Asian, and South American immigration history. Families searching for a better life, leaving the home country they've always known with a mix of uncertainty and excitement, met with discrimination and opportunity. Immigrants have long been the backbone of our country. More than 86 million people have legally immigrated to the United States between 1783 and 2019, and their impacts cannot be understated. In America, unless you're a Native American, you are here as a product of immigration, whether voluntary or forced. From 1882 to 1935, Asian immigrants made major contributions to the development of the United States. Yet they were systematically denied entry and naturalization rights until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. Asian presence in the United States was not well received. Whether from China, Korea, India, the Philippines, or Japan, there was a common experience of discrimination and exclusion in the New World. And in America, the history of racism against the Japanese begins with racism against the Chinese. In the 1850s, a large number of Chinese immigrants began arriving mainly in California and the West. They worked high-risk, low-wage jobs, such as mining and railroad construction. Racism against them was almost immediate, a common cry being that of Asians coming to steal white jobs. In 1854, the California Supreme Court took the side of racism in the case People v. Hall. George Hall was a white American who had shot and killed Chinese immigrant Ling Sing. Testimonies from witnesses were rejected on account of witnesses also being Asian. The Supreme Court ruled that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court, effectively meaning that white Americans could escape punishment for anti-Asian violence. On October 24, 1871, a mob of 500 white and Latino people stormed Chinatown and committed the largest mass lynching in American history, ending in 18 deaths. At the time, this was over 10% of the small Chinese population, which pre-massacre in LA was only 172 people. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first major law restricting immigration to the United States. It prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to or even entering the United States for 10 years, making it impossible for immigrants to re-enter the country if they visited home in China. There were minor exempt classes such as teachers and diplomats. The Naturalization Act of 1870 gave naturalization rights to aliens of African nativity and descent. This did not expand to other groups, particularly Asians. Laws against Asian rights have historically led to discrimination against Asians, similar to other minority groups. The roots of Japanese American immigrant communities lie within Hawaii. Notably, this was before Hawaii was annexed by the U.S. in 1898. The Kingdom of Hawaii had a population of 70 Japanese immigrants in the 1970s, a number which rose to over 2,000 20 years later. They were warmly welcomed to Hawaii by the local government and local population. Thanks to the friendship treaty established between the Kingdom of Hawaii and Japan in 1860, there was a fondness between the Japanese and Hawaiian governments. Upon emigrating, Japanese people were granted a 2-week respite to recover from their journey. Kindness and hospitality was seen in much of Hawaii's reception to Japanese immigrants. They often worked sugar plantations until better work appeared in the continental U.S. They came in search of a better life, chasing the illustrious rumors of prosperity in the land of opportunity. Railroads, sawmills, and canneries drew people in. Often immigrants worked as agricultural laborers and similar occupations. Many of those who opposed Chinese immigrants in the continental states would later transfer those feelings to the Japanese people as well, becoming known as the anti-Japanese movement, which was embraced in nearly all sectors of society in Western states. Approximately 12,000 of the 38,000 Japanese immigrants who entered America through Hawaii settled in California. Many found work, becoming an integral part in the California's agricultural workforce. Around the same time, the West Coast experienced a period of economic growth and development, allowing for many Japanese to gain economic achievement. The white population did not like this, viewing Japanese as aggressive in connection to Japan's assertiveness in world conflicts. In turn, people began perceiving immigrants as a threat. Protests started breaking out in California, stemming from Japanese economic achievement, Japanese cultural heritage, and long-term anti-Chinese sentiment. Despite there already being heavy restrictions and regulations on Chinese immigration, anti-Chinese sentiments remained strong, now wrapped up in anti-Japanese sentiments as well, eventually becoming synonymous in California. Japanese citizens experienced severe racial discrimination, including difficulty with job security and day-to-day racism when outside their communities. Employers would often take advantage of their poor economic standing and pay them less than a white American would be paid. This enraged white Americans, as this exploitation was perceived as Asians taking American jobs. Asians often worked high-risk, low-wage, much-needed jobs that were not desired by the general white populace. Often, Asians faced violence and unfair treatment from bigots within society. In the 1900s, anti-Japanese sentiments were growing stronger and stronger. The California Democratic Party even aligned itself as being anti-Japanese. San Francisco Mayor Flellen started a rumor of the bubonic plague as a means to isolate Japanese and Chinese neighborhoods within the city. The San Francisco School Board also declared that it intended to remove all Japanese students to one Oriental school. Meanwhile, local labor groups were organizing anti-Japanese protests. A professor of sociology at Stanford, Dr. Ross, declared that Japanese were incapable of assimilation. He said that they work for low wages and have very low standards of living, and lack correct political feelings for U.S. democratic institutions. Dr. Ross said, "Should the worst come to the worst, it would be better for us to turn our guns on every vessel bringing Japanese to our shore, rather than to permit them to land." 6 years later, the San Francisco School Board segregated all Asian students. This upset Japan, leading President Theodore Roosevelt to write to his son Kermit in private, "I am being horribly bothered about this Japanese business. The infernal fools in California, especially San Francisco, insult the Japanese recklessly, and in the event of war, it will be the nation as a whole that will pay the consequences." Roosevelt swiftly began working for the betterment of the Japanese in America. He sent an investigator to look into the segregation of school children, the boycotting of Japanese restaurants, and hate crimes being committed against the Japanese. The Metcalfe report came back detailing violence against Japanese immigrants and citizens alike, including Japanese scientists who had arrived to help with natural disaster relief. YouTuber milestone. My audio randomly cut out throughout the rest of the video. I'm wearing pigtails to show that times have changed. Comment below who wore it better, day 1 me or day 2 me. Theodore Roosevelt, in an attempt to make peace with both Japan and California, issued an informal gentleman's agreement in 1906. This restricted the amount of U.S. immigration passports issued by Japan to its citizens. In exchange, San Francisco was forced to repeal its Japanese-American school segregation order. This still allowed for wives, children, and parents of current immigrants to enter the U.S. This also allowed for the Japanese-American Association to be established. This was a primarily bureaucratic establishment helpful for processing certificates and applications. Later, it would be accused of being a part of an invisible government with alleged Japanese imperialist ambitions. Japanese immigrants were able to exploit a loophole in the gentleman's agreement, which allowed for family members of those already in America to migrate. Tens of thousands of immigrant women began arriving. Called picture brides, a growing number of women in Japan immigrated to the States, entering arranged marriages with immigrant men who they'd never met. In 1909, 238 groups in California affiliated with the Asiatic Exclusion League, 202 of which were labor organizations. The largest was the Oriental Exclusion League of California, toting 110,000 members. That same year, the California State Senate made a statement claiming that within 10 years, Japanese would outnumber whites. sounds a lot like the Great Replacement Theory. As well, unfortunately, Roosevelt's defense of the Japanese people dwindled over the years, giving further and further into racism. The first alien land law was passed in California in 1913, prohibiting aliens ineligible for citizenship from buying agricultural land. This only allowed Asian immigrants to lease land for up to 3 years. 3 years later, the Literacy Act required all immigrants seeking entry to the U.S. to take a literacy test. This was mainly for European immigrants, barring entry to idiots, imbeciles, epileptics, anarchists, and other undesirables. This law also created the Asiatic Barred Zone. This barred entry to immigrants from India, most of Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, Asiatic Russia, and the Middle East. Japan and the Philippines were excluded from the bar zone because Japan already had regulations in place. By 1920, over 450,000 acres of land were owned by Japanese immigrant farmers in California, contributing 10% of crop income to the market. At least one Japanese immigrant became an American-made millionaire. This is just a snapshot of how significant of a contribution they made to the agricultural economy and to broader society. In 1920, California made a revision to the laws which prohibited immigration, closing the loophole for picture brides. By 1925, Washington, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Idaho had adopted similar laws. First-generation immigrants banded together to fund legal challenges to land and naturalization laws, all of which the U.S. Supreme Court turned back in 1922 and 1923. Also in 1922, Takao Ozawa versus United States, the Supreme Court found Ozawa ineligible for naturalization after living in the United States for 20 years. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reeds Act or Asian Exclusion Act, imposed strict regulations on immigration from non-European countries, effectively ending Japanese immigration to the States, at the time seemingly forever. The Immigration Act and the Supreme Court's ruling in Ozawa versus U.S. made it illegal for Japanese people to become naturalized citizens in the United States. Despite all the challenges, Japanese immigrants and their American-born children built and established communities and institutions. U.S. agriculture often was the core economic engine of the community. Little Tokyos appeared in West Coast cities with churches, newspapers, youth organizations, and political and social organizations. As global tensions grew, first-generation Japanese immigrants begged Japan not to go to war with the U.S., but it did not work. In 1941, Dr. Seuss released some racist propaganda. He produced several posters depicting Japanese Americans as being a part of the fifth column, referring to a group of secret supporters of an enemy who engage in espionage or sabotage. This idea was so powerful that the American public demanded drastic action. Seuss dutifully produced what was asked of him, but later felt deep guilt and regret for his complicity in the hysteria-inducing propaganda machine that, spoilers, led to thousands being interned by executive order without charge or trial. In part, Horton Hears a Who is an apology to the Japanese. Dedicated to a Japanese friend, it is a loose metaphor for American operations in Japan. After Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans were on edge, fearing the worst. They became victims of violence and increased suspicion. For nearly a decade before the war, various government agencies had had Japanese American communities under surveillance, in anticipation for a potential war with Japan. They put together custodial detention lists of those to arrest should war break out. These lists allowed government to round up hostile foreigners or enemy aliens, and they did so hours within the attack on Pearl Harbor without trial. Many detained were male community leaders, suspected for the positions they held rather than for their actions. This included Buddhist priests and heads of the Japanese Association branches. People suspected of being part of the fifth column, as expressed by Dr. Seuss. They were initially held locally, with some prisoners of German and Italian descent. Then they were moved to internment camps. There they spent most of the war, alongside Japanese Latin Americans who had been evicted from their homes and brought to U.S. internment camps. Japanese American college students weren't allowed to go to school. There were 7:30 curfews put in place, and they could no longer travel 5 miles from their home. They brought it to the Supreme Court, who ruled that in times of war, the Army had the right to do just as they were doing. A lot of families moved in together because of the restriction that they couldn't travel 5 miles from their homes. And as many had been fired, everyone started using their savings. In response to xenophobic and racist wartime hysteria after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942. This gave the Army power over whomever it saw fit by military necessity. This included children, pregnant women, and the elderly. This allowed for the forced removal and relocation of over 1,200,000 people of even partial Japanese descent along the West Coast. By this time, many Japanese families had depleted their savings. Signs appeared on street posts saying all people of Japanese ancestry must leave, giving some only a week's notice. Notices were posted to register your family for evacuation or face criminal penalties. These were addressed to alien and non-alien, meaning citizens. Over 2/3 detained were American citizens. At first, they had been ordered to leave restricted areas and move inland as a voluntary evacuation, but the government froze their bank accounts and imposed local curfews, making many unable to leave. Leaders of other Western states objected, and with only 5,000 of 110,000 Japanese Americans moved, plans had changed. They were relocated to short-term detention facilities referred to as gathering centers. Among these was the Assembly Center, often a repurposed existing venue, such as horse racing tracks or exhibition grounds that were near where Japanese Americans were being expelled. Larger sites like Santa Anita and Tanforna in California and Puyallup in Seattle often had detainees living in makeshift quarters in poorly converted stables and barracks, sleeping sometimes on rubber mattresses, sometimes on bags of hay, sometimes with fresh paint on the wall barely masking the smell of horse. Dust everywhere. Locations normally only fit for animals. They were given a bag with a number on it and told, while you're here, you don't use your family name, you use your number, losing touch with another part of their identity. They couldn't take pets. There was a strict lights out with a searchlight that stayed all night long, and the lines for food were gigantic. Adults remained calm, not to fill their children with fear, continuing to smile and carry on. Okay, I'm gonna try some Japanese. Kodomo no tame ni. Kodomo no tame ni. For the sake of the children. I probably said that so wrong. There were libraries and books in schools. They had clubs and Cub Scouts. But the reality of the situation was lost on few. A month after Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, he issued Executive Order 9102. This created the War Relocation Authority, the WRA. This agency was responsible for the removal, relocation, and imprisonment of Japanese Americans affected by Executive Order 9066. The WRA constructed and oversaw 10 concentration camps across the U.S. These were very different concentration camps from the Nazi death camps. Merriam-Webster's dictionary describes a concentration camp as a place where a large number of people, such as prisoners of war, political prisoners, refugees, or the members of a ethnic or religious minority, are detained and confined under National Guard. After a stay in an assembly center, lasting several weeks to months, Japanese Americans were transferred to the camps. Some were put on trains with windows covered in black paper or cloth. Each car had a soldier with a rifle. This was during Jim Crow, and one person who had rode on the bus outside of the camp as an Asian man was told to sit with the whites. He was shocked and said, "I'm the enemy alien, and yet they treat me better than the people who live here." Just a little intersectionality for you there. These camps were situated in desolate deserts and prairie locations across the western U.S. There were no trees, nothing to block the wind. In Arkansas, these relocation centers were guarded with barbed wire and guard towers. Many were still being constructed as those incarcerated moved in. They were overcrowded and unsanitary, so illness spread through the camps without access to proper medical care. Inmates shared communal bathrooms, laundry facilities, and dining halls. There was inadequate food and a vast lack of privacy. Sometimes 7 people were living in one room. Many marked the lack of privacy and liberty as what they missed most. There were frequent dust storms. In the camps, they were expected to keep things running, teaching classrooms, maintaining the property, raising crops and livestock. The WRA tried to have the camps function as small towns, with schools and rec centers even holding local elections. Inmates took on much of the responsibility, from preparing and serving food to harvesting firewood, being paid $12 to $19 a month. They also outlawed Japanese schools in the camps. Assimilation, baby. Guess Dr. Ross was wrong. A portion of that generation lost the Japanese language, and kids went by Americanized names for simplicity's sake. So there was definitely loss of culture. There was also a breakdown within the family unit, given the strange social circumstances. They did allow for Japanese dances, plays, and songs. There were happy moments that came out of their misery. Inmates worked to make their space as much their own as possible, planting gardens and crafting furniture and decorations. There were labor strikes and even rioting, but most people just endured and tried to establish some sense of normal. But the realities around them were ever present. It never truly gave the illusion that they were not imprisoned. Families were incarcerated for several years. Teenagers and young adults were incarcerated when they wanted to be in school and start their lives. Children were born and grew up their first few years within the camps. The government knew that it was a bad look, fighting in the name of freedom, with your citizens, even children, imprisoned without a cause for years. So they had to make it look justifiable. They framed it as orderly and humane and absolutely necessary. They made sure to document it with photographs, pamphlets, and propaganda films. They hoped that documenting it would show the government's goodwill and service. Not all photos were approved for circulation by the WRA. One of the photographers hired was one of history's greats, Dorothea Lange. When they saw how Lange was visually narrating the story and the heartbreak the people felt, the WRA became less than kind to her. She humanized them too much in her photos. Internal memos from the WRA in 1942 said that they were deeply concerned about Lange's photos and described her as highly emotional. Her negatives were surrendered and her prints impounded. 80 of her 700 photos were considered impounded. It's unclear what the distinction was, but some similarities between them include armed U.S. soldiers, photos of racetracks where Japanese Americans slept in horse stalls, as well as the lines that they had to wait in for food, as well as photos of Japanese Americans in U.S. Army uniforms. One of the ones that didn't fit into a clear category was one of a Buddhist priest locking his door before evacuation. Just 4 months after Lange started, she was released from the program. They even withheld most of her non-imported photos from the American public for the rest of the war. When asked about her experiences, Lange said they wanted a record, but not a public record. Lange's photos were not the only ones impounded. Satsuki Ino, who was born in the Tule Lake segregation, a maximum security concentration camp, says about the situation, "The government was so effective at distorting the true narrative of what they did, why they did it, and what happened to the people." A poll in 1942 showed that 93% of Americans were in favor of removing Japanese immigrants. 59% even supported the removal of Japanese American citizens, as many Americans did not generally recognize Japanese people as ordinary people. Only 1% opposed the internment of Japanese immigrants, and 25% opposed the internment of Japanese American citizens. The 1% who opposed believed that Franklin Roosevelt's executive orders were not of military necessity, but rather from the public's lack of acceptance of Japanese people. Japanese people in America factually posed no threat or harm to the country, juxtaposed with German immigrants who genuinely posed a threat to national security. 40,000 people of German descent were part of a pro-Nazi organization called the German American Bund. Some Germans did end up in the camps with the Japanese, but to nowhere near the scale. The harmful legislation of 1942 was repealed in 1952, but the established principles continue to influence U.S. immigration policy today, with an emphasis of maintaining the racial homogeneity of the country. Words are hard. I hope I'm saying all of my words right. From 1942 to 1943, while Japanese Americans were still in the camps, propaganda posters appeared of the Tokyo Kid. He looked like this. Just wow. He doesn't even look human. He's some horrifying goblin man. He's such a dehumanization. Notice the bloody knife and the broken English that I'm not even gonna touch. Another trope used was the protection of women. Sound familiar? Identifying Japanese as savages that terrorized young women. In early 1943, military service eligibility was restored to Japanese Americans. In Hawaii, there was no mass incarceration, and so many did enlist. Young men in camps enlisted too, but in much smaller numbers, detesting their living situation. In 1943, the government admitted that there was no sabotage or espionage or fifth column. That same year, Francis Biddle lamented that the present practice of keeping loyal American citizens in concentration camps for longer than is necessary is dangerous and repugnant to the principles of our government. In 1944, the government started drafting incarcerated Japanese American citizens from concentration camps. Some 300 resisted the draft, refusing until their community rights had been restored. This history of draft resistors was largely suppressed in the community for 40 years. Most Japanese soldiers were segregated to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became one of the most decorated units who fought in some of the toughest battles on the European front. Their contribution to the Allied forces were many. In late 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that the continued detention of American citizens without charges was unconstitutional, when Mitsuye Endo challenged her continued incarceration, despite her acknowledged loyalty. January 1945, Japanese Americans began being allowed back to the West Coast. In fall of that year, the war ended and the camps began closing down. Remaining incarcerees were given $25 and a train ticket to their pre-war addresses. Many no longer had a home or a job to return to. Post-war prejudices made finding work difficult. Incarcerees faced discrimination and resentment from workers and tenants alike. There was also a huge culture shock for some, especially those who had grown up in the concentration camps. The camps weren't fully closed until the next year in 1946, a year after the Japanese surrendered. In 1946, former Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes wrote, "We gave the fancy name of relocation centers to these dust bowls, but they were concentration camps nonetheless." It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it wasn't. President Harry Truman disbanded the RWA that same year and moved all records, including tens of thousands of negative photos, to the National Archives. It would take another 25 years before Lang's photos had been largely seen by the general public when her former assistant asked that they be removed from the archives. When Japanese Americans were freed from the camps, many had nowhere to go. Pre-war Little Tokyos had largely been repopulated by other minority groups in their absence. They faced many challenges, including harsh competition for employment and housing. They had to start back over and slowly rebuild their communities. Many lost their family farms and had to start back over as laborers. Many ex-incarcerees, especially the elderly, faced homelessness. People had been stripped away from their jobs, their homes, their farms, their pets, their education. Most people were never able to recover. The incarcerated lost an estimated $400 million in property during the war. After the camps closed, luckily many Americans recognized the camps as a mistake, even citing the heroism of Japanese soldiers. They began overturning racist legislation like the alien land laws and bans on naturalization, also advocating and making appeals for fair treatment. They even were proclaimed as a model minority, which had its own setbacks in the future. In a 1961 interview, Harry S. Truman stated they were concentration camps. They called it relocation, but they put them in concentration camps. And I was against it. We were in a period of emergency, but it was still the wrong thing to do. The trauma of the incarceration was not light. The post-war silence about the camps led younger Japanese Americans, inspired by the civil rights movement, to demand a true reckoning on what had happened and eventually proper reparations for their incarceration. In the 1970s, this would be known as the Redress Movement, leading Ronald Reagan to sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The U.S. government officially apologized for wartime incarceration, admitting that it was a result of racism, hysteria, and failed political leadership, and gave $20,000 payments to surviving victims. Before then, some survivors felt afraid to talk about what had happened, and even lacked concrete evidence that it had happened to them at all. Post-redress, Japanese Americans strove to make their experiences known, hoping to prevent future government abuses against other groups of people. June Burke, who was around 8 or 9 when she went to the camps, said in 2024, "We have to learn from past mistakes. We have to learn to teach our kids not to hate, have them feel tenderness and kindness to one another." I think that's so important. The only way we can do that is how we treat each other. Race or color, ethnicity don't come into that. That's universal. The Japanese American National Museum and the AJC issued a joint statement which concluded, "A concentration camp is a place where people are imprisoned not because of the crimes they have committed, but simply because of who they are." Although many groups have been singled out for such persecution throughout history, despite differences, all had one thing in common. The people in power removed a minority group from the general population, and the rest of society let it happen. For a closing quote, I would like to read a few paragraphs from one of my sources directly. This is from the source Densho, which my sources will be linked below. As we grapple with contemporary controversies surrounding immigration, terrorism, and the infringement of civil liberties in the name of public safety, parallels between past and present abound. Understanding this story offers opportunities for difficult, thought-provoking conversation and raises important questions. How does a democracy weigh individual rights against national security? Who is considered a real American? Does this change during times of fear? What is our responsibility to citizens and immigrants denied their constitutional rights? Knowledge of this history helps to explain much of the Japanese American community today. Although these events took place over 3/4 of a century ago, they left a powerful legacy, influencing everything from where Japanese Americans are born and raised to how they relate to their elders and raise their children. Keeping memories of the incarceration alive also gives Japanese Americans the power and responsibility to speak out when other groups are unfairly targeted because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or other identity. Having once been victims of such discriminatory policies, Japanese Americans are keenly aware of that history. This gives their voice special authority when speaking out for others. The materials on this site bear witness to the fact that when threatened, we can easily discard our democratic ideals of justice and equality to chase after imaginary enemies. Furthermore, false rumors, sensationalized and given credence by a profit-maximizing media and vote-seeking politicians, can overwhelm and contradict research and evidence-based analysis. These are valuable lessons for all Americans, citizen, immigrant, and refugee alike, to remember as we confront challenges like Islamophobia, increasing hate violence, and the deep-seated nature of institutional racism that criminalizes Black and brown communities across the country. Densho is a Japanese term meaning to pass stories to the next generation or to leave a legacy. We work to preserve the stories of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans in order to promote an examination of democracy and an expectance of civil engagement. It is our great hope that you will share this story, initiate these important conversations within your own community, and inspire future leaders to build a legacy of justice and equity for all. Thank you.